Welcome to PLATO Frontiers in Life Sciences. Get to talk about life on Venus today, you and Jaime Cordova. Why don't you go ahead and start, because I can't see right now. I've got the full screen up, and if you want to just start and say hello to everybody, that'd be great.
Okay. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Jaime, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to do this talk. I haven't done these Plato talks before because I don't normally work in life sciences, but through some accident, ended up writing a paper on possibility of life on Venus, and so here I am. I'm outside, so if it gets a little bit windy, you might hear some wind noise. That's okay. So I won't spend too much time on the first few slides, which I have to do with life. Jaime will talk more about it, but I just want to set the stage. What is driving space exploration these days, beyond the human exploration, is are we alone in the universe? And as you all know, Earth is the only planet we know which has life. And so all our knowledge is based on the life forms that we know, and that can be a problem sometimes. The first question is, of course, how did life begin? And with respect to the space exploration, could life have begun on other planets in our system or moons? And by extension, on planets around other stars? And that's the astrophysics community, which is very large, and they are now asking for lots of money to go and explore the exoplanets, beginning with the James Webb Space Telescope, which will be launched just for a year from now. I hope Jaime will touch upon the question, what is life? What are we talking about? Obviously, when I'm discussing life, we're not talking about intelligent life, but very primitive forms. So let's go on. Typically what we know for requirements of life are liquid water, nutrients, the standard schnapps, and some other species like selenium, zinc, etc. But most importantly, you need energy, solar or geothermal. So let's go to Venus all the way. The Venus today is not a very pleasant place to begin with, at least on the surface. You have a high surface temperature, about 750 Kelvin, approximately 475 centigrade. There's no liquid water on the surface, and the surface pressure is about 93 times what we find on Earth on a normal day. The atmosphere is mostly carbon dioxide with a small amount of nitrogen, and the amount of nitrogen appears to vary with altitude. That's a recent finding, although we have known about it for the last 40 some years. Venus has a very thick cloud cover that extends from about 48 kilometers, 47 kilometers above the surface, and goes up to as high as about 70, 72 kilometers in equatorial latitudes, and it dips over the poles to around 67 kilometers. So it's a good solid 25 to maybe 28, 30 kilometers thick atmosphere. A cloud cover. However, the cloud particle density is not very thick. It's much lower than what we find in a typical thunderstorm cloud that we find in Madison, for example. And in the cloud layer, the winds are very fast. If you have a floating balloon, it can go around the planet in about 4 days at around 65 kilometers altitude, or about 6 to 8 days at a lower altitude of about 55, 58 kilometers. Near the surface, the winds are light. However, because the atmosphere is so thick, about 65 times the density of Earth's atmosphere at the surface, they carry a lot of power. They can knock you down. They're essentially gale force winds on the surface, about a meter per second. So, if Venus is hot today, what about the past? And this has been a question that has been asked in recent years. And I won't go into how we know Venus had liquid water in the past, but by comparison of the hydrogen to deuterium isotopes, people have surmised that because Venus is so enriched in deuterium compared to Earth, Venus must have lost its water, which means it must have had liquid water. And several people have looked into the question, most recently Michael Way and Tony Genio. They ran the model, and they have basically come out with statement that after an early period when Venus had magma oceans in the first billion years or so, there was a cool early Venus, and then Venus harbored liquid water on the surface, essentially an Earth-like ocean, for up to 3 billion years. And it lost its water only in the last maybe 900 to a billion years or so. So any life that could have evolved or originated on Venus happened about a billion years ago. So in 2018, we published a paper about the possibility of life. And our main concern was what are the contrast features that we see in the Venus cloud cover made up of? I'm showing you some pictures of Venus and Earth. In the left panel, the top two rows, the three small pictures labeled A, B, C, D, E, F, they are Venus images at different wavelengths from UV to short infrared. And the bottom two panels are views of the Earth from a geosynchronous weather satellite, something that Vern Sumi on this campus invented about 50 some years ago, 1960s. As you can see in the Earth pictures, you can make out the cloud forms from all the way from visible to far in thermal infrared. You see the in the thermal infrared, you see the oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that. There we go. You can see the hot and the temperature contrast between the land and the ocean. In the visible, of course, the white features. This is the G, talking about the G image. You can make out the clouds in the visible wavelength. But if you look at the water vapor image, you don't see the land-ocean contrast at all. What you are looking at are essentially patterns of the abundances or variations in the abundance of water vapor. But even there, you can make out the clouds, like in the picture J in the lower left corner, and on the right you have the thermal infrared. You can make out the white patch, so you know they are clouds, but they correlate. What you don't see in the thermal infrared are the dry areas. So if you compare picture A, which is Venus in ultraviolet light at 283 nanometers, that is more similar to the water vapor image that we see. Except that in the case of Venus, the dark patches do not mean a clear atmosphere like it does on Earth. It means that there's some absorber in the clouds that is absorbing that particular wavelength. But its other physical properties are exactly the same as the cloud elsewhere, as in picture D, which is taken through a clear filter, that is no filter, white light. And E is another image from Messenger. The D was taken through Galileo. And in F, you see the day and night contrast in near infrared light. And for more than 100 years, we don't know what is the material that causes these patterns in the ultraviolet light. And there's a movie of how these patterns evolve. This is taken from Akatsuki satellite. And you can see these dark patches. They never look the same. They always evolve over time scales of a few minutes to a few hours. And over months, they undergo through a different morphology that appears to be repetitive. So we see similar patterns, but never exactly the same. It's like fingerprints. You know what a fingerprint looks like, but no two fingerprints are exactly the same. And that's the same story with the Venus clouds. So the mystery was what causes this contrast, and many different species were proposed. Why won't it skip? I want to go to the next. Oh, here we go. To explain them, but none of the candidates proposed work out very well to explain the contrast. Here's what the atmosphere looks like. The shaded regions are the cloud region. The horizontal axis is temperature, vertical axis is altitude. And by the top of the pink layer, most of the UV is absorbed by the cloud above it. The temperature lapse rate is almost neutral, slightly stable, up to about 30, 40 kilometers. It's shown by those dotted points. And the colored lines and the black line, they show how the temperature varies from 100 kilometers down to the surface. So what we are talking about, what we proposed in a paper in Astrobiology in 2018 was that there may be some forms of microorganisms that originated on Venus more than 1 billion years ago and migrated to the clouds when Venus was losing its water. And they've been there since then for the last 1 billion years. Now, that's a pretty steep order. We don't even know whether bacteria survive even a week in Earth's clouds because they usually get rained out. But we do know that all Earth clouds, well, not all, but most have bacteria. They've been discovered and they can travel thousands of kilometers. So the question is, can any microorganisms survive in this kind of cloud, which is not very hospitable because the clouds are made up of sulfuric acid solution. Could be as high as 75-80% solution. And this is a similar diagram. Essentially, you have this is a cross section actually across latitude with pressure, and it shows how the clouds dip in the shaded part. The blue part is clear, and dotted pink part at the bottom is also nearly clear, except there may be some haze. But the critical thing is that any life would have to be between those two lines, between about 1 bar pressure, slightly higher, and to maybe 100, 200 millibars up here at the top. And there's some liquid water available in the droplets of sulfuric acid, and there are nutrients. We know that there's nitrogen in the atmosphere, and there's carbon, hydrogen from the sulfuric acid, and also some water vapor. And we know there is some iron which is detected, and also phosphorus. So this is the kind of picture we put forward, that you have winds at the surface that keep the microorganisms aloft. There are gravity waves that can make them rise all the way to the cloud top, where they may get damaged by UV light and then either get form spores, and their dead matter is scavenged by other bacteria or they fall down. And there's the iron sulfur chemistry that we propose for these bacteria, because some of the iron sulfur bacteria, like Bacillus, have absorption properties which are very similar to Venus, which is shown in this graph on the upper right. And then recently we discovered phosphine. About a month ago, there was a paper, and that's the debate going on for the last month, because phosphine is not very stable. We have no means of producing phosphine in an oxidizing atmosphere like Venus. It is found in large planets like Jupiter and Saturn, where it is made in the deep interior, because there's loss of hydrogen there. The amount of phosphine they detected is about 20 parts per billion, and because phosphine is unstable in the Venus atmosphere, it would have to be continuously replenished. And that brings up, is there any kind of chemistry or a supply of phosphine? And so far, there is no such source. And that brings up the question of life. And how will we find out? I can touch upon that briefly here. I think I already did that. If it turns out, of course, that life is progressing, and then we have a monumental discovery that we are not alone. We will have discovered life on another planet. We still don't know how it originated there or got there, but at least we are not alone. That's the question. So the questions that we need to look at are: when did Venus lose its surface ocean? How much water was lost and when? We have sort of an idea that it was 1 billion years ago, but we need to confirm that. It's only a conjecture. What other trace species in the atmosphere besides phosphorus, iron? What else can support life? And are there any biosignatures present in the data that we have on the atmosphere and that you can detect remotely? What we need to do is certainly measure the physical, optical, spectral, chemical, and biological properties of the cloud droplets. It's not very easy to do, as you can imagine. But there are missions coming up. Actually, just 2 days from today, Bepi Colombo, a spacecraft designed by ESA and JAXA, is on its way to Mercury, and it will have its first Venus flyby on October 15th. It'll go past Venus again to reduce the speed in August 2021. That will be much closer, and they may have a better chance of looking for any signs of phosphine on that second approach. The first one is too far away. I don't think they'll be able to see anything, but I could be wrong. In 2025, the Indian Space Research Organization is going to launch an orbiter around Venus, and the same year or shortly around that time or after, JAXA will launch Akatsuki 2 to its Lagrange points, Venus and Lagrange points. 2029, when there are D, and I skipped over Da Vinci and Veritas missions, which are under consideration, they will be launched by NASA, selected in 2026. And in 2031, we have Envision, it's selected by ESA, it's a radar. The Indian orbiter is also a radar mission, but it will also carry some other payload. And Veritas is a radar mission also. So of all these missions, only Da Vinci has a probe that will enter the atmosphere besides Venera D. And so if nothing else detects life or any possibility of life, Da Vinci has the best chance of sampling the chemistry. It's not going to look for life the way it is designed now. And two private initiatives, Breakthrough and Rocket Lab, they have announced plans to send missions to Venus to discover life. And I'll stop there and hand it over to Jaime. And I guess I have to do something here, which is to stop sharing my screen. There. Okay.
All right. Give me a quick sec. Make sure that this thing is up and running. Thanks, Sanjay. And thanks for doing this with me.
Oh, my pleasure. I didn't spend any time preparing it.
All right, so Venus. Sanjay talked a little bit about. Can you guys see my slides? You see my slides?
Yeah, they look good. Way to go.
All right, cool. All right. So Sanjay talked a little bit about specifically about in regards to Venus's conditions. And I got involved in this work actually shortly after I arrived here. I'm a third-year PhD candidate. When I got here, I got in contact with Sanjay, and the rest is sort of history. I've been working with Sanjay now, doing some of this work aside from my PhD work in the Department of Genetics. So I'm going to talk a little bit about looking at Venus through a habitable lens, and looking at what forms of life can actually be there. So we talked a little bit about the conditions. I'll review them a little bit more myself. But what sort of organisms can we expect to see there, and what characteristics would life have to have? So first, Sanjay mentioned about talking about what is life. So there's actually no really consensus regarding how life is defined. Now, the way that generally, or the popular way of talking about life, or what characteristics life should have, would be it would have a life cycle, would undergo metabolism, or it would reproduce, and then it would evolve and adapt. Now, the reason why there isn't necessarily a consensus is because if you say grow, life has to grow. Well, for example, you've got crystals that can grow. Could you define that as life? So there's not really a consensus in terms of what life is. But most popularly, and at least for biologists like myself, these are sort of the characteristics that we go to, and obviously having cells. So with Venus, Sanjay touched on this a little bit. So does it have the right stuff to be habitable? So there's 4 different things that if you're looking at Venus, or if you're looking at any planet, I should say, through a habitable lens, there's 4 things that it requires. So a solvent for biochemical reactions, the appropriate temperature and physicochemical conditions for life to survive there. It has to have some form of energy that's available to that hypothetical life. And then it also has to have biologically relevant elements. So I'll start off with water. So that's a solvent that's necessary for for biochemical reactions. We know that here on Earth, all known forms of life require water. Now, all known forms of life can require water. There are some hypotheticals that maybe life could use something else, but as far as we know in all life, and this is what guides astrobiology missions, we look for water. Example of that is, let's say there's water there's some water in our blood. You can't replace that water that's in our blood with gasoline and still expect us to survive, obviously, right? So our cells are made up, do contain water that help us stay alive. Now, as Sanjay mentioned, most but not all water is gone. Some does remain in the atmosphere with very low abundance. And because the atmosphere is made up of well into 70% or 80% sulfuric acid, sulfuric acid has one of its properties. It's very hygroscopic, which means that it can attach water very easily. So it's possible that some of that sulfuric acid may have some water attached to it, which would be available to life should it exist in the clouds. Now, in terms of appropriate physicochemical conditions, the altitude that we're really interested in and this altitude can vary depending on who you ask. I believe Sanjay goes up to 57 kilometers. I've been focusing on 47.5 to 50.5 kilometers above the surface, and the reason behind that is that at that altitude you have temperatures that are about 90 degrees Celsius to 60 degrees Celsius. With as you go higher up into the clouds, the temperature decreases, and this is well within the limits of life. So we know that at least for life here on Earth, as far as has been described, the upper temperature limit of life is about 121 degrees Celsius. This is an archaea called Geogamma barosi, also known as strain 121, that has been shown to survive in temperatures up to 121 degrees Celsius. The second most, I guess you could say, thermophile. So a thermophile is a form of life or a microorganism, I should say, that can survive in extreme temperatures. Would be Methanopyrus candeleri, which this amoeba can survive, archaea can survive in temperatures as high as 116 degrees Celsius. Now, I mentioned there's other altitudes that can be of interest. So, for example, what if we go to higher altitudes? Now, the top layer of the Venus clouds, drop to a temperature of about negative 45 degrees Celsius. And we know that there have been studies using terrestrial organisms that show that while they may not necessarily be metabolically active, there is bacteria that can survive, that can lay dormant in these temperatures. If you go down to 62 kilometers, you get down to negative 25 degrees Celsius, and there are bacteria down in Antarctica that have been shown to be able to survive and reproduce in these conditions. So we know that life exists that can survive at this wide range of temperatures, whether that be down to negative 25 degrees Celsius or up to 90 degrees Celsius and even higher. Another part of the appropriate physical chemical conditions would be the atmospheric pressure. So on Venus, in that altitude range, you have atmospheric pressures that range from 0.1 atmospheres, which is roughly about the atmospheric pressure that you would see on the surface of Mars, and 1 atmosphere, which is what we see here on the at sea level on Earth. So those conditions aren't necessarily a concern for life. The next part is the pH. As was mentioned earlier, by Sanjay, there are high levels of sulfuric acid that are present in the clouds, making up about 70 to 85% of the clouds, which means that it's an estimated pH in the clouds of about negative 1.5 to 0.5. Admittedly, when I first started getting involved in this work, I do microbiology work. It's part of my PhD work, but I didn't know that there was such a thing as a negative pH. But apparently there is. Now, this pH range is to a certain extent outside of the known limits of life. So we don't know of any organisms that can go down to negative that can survive in pH of down to negative 1.5. The closest organism that we know of is a Picrophilus, which can survive at a pH of about negative 0.06. But so far, that's what we understand so far. And I'll mention in a little while why this isn't necessarily a nail in the coffin of, okay, let's stop searching for life on Venus, or let's stop trying to understand what such life can look like. In terms of energy, so because Venus is obviously closer to the sun, there's more energy and radiation that's reaching Venus. And now, because there's more radiation that's reaching Venus, that can be of concern, because we know, for example, for life here on Earth, if we're exposed to, say, for example, us humans, if we go outside and tan for a little bit too long, we're exposed to a lot more UV rays, and we can potentially end up getting skin cancer. And that's because of DNA damage that's going on to our cells. Well, interestingly enough, because of how thick the cloud layers are, the UV flux that actually reaches the heights that we're interested is comparable to when life arose on Earth. So we know that that's not necessarily a limiting factor, or we know that radiation isn't necessarily a limiting factor. In addition, there are some hypotheses that because of the absorbance that those UV absorbers are, which we believe could potentially be life, there are some hypotheses that they could be undergoing photosynthesis. And we know that the photosynthetic photon flux density, which is basically the amount of light that is available for photosynthesis that reaches Venus, is comparable to what reaches the surface of the Earth. And in fact, this is available at different wavelengths, that it's actually possible for it to both be oxygenic photosynthesis or anoxygenic photosynthesis. Now, because of the low amount of molecular oxygen that's actually present in the clouds, odds are is that these bacteria or these hypothetical organisms would be undergoing an oxygenic photosynthesis, so not without oxygen. Aside from photosynthesis, the other main form of energy gaining that we understand or that we know of here on Earth is chemosynthesis, which is essentially producing energy from different forms of chemicals or from different chemical elements. We see this down at the bottom of the ocean in hydrothermal vents. And this is based on the presence of inorganic compounds and carbon that's available in the clouds. So we know that this is another possibility. This is more than likely, we more than likely expect to see a chemosynthetic organism in the clouds compared to a photosynthetic organism, just based on the differences of their characteristics. Finally, the last part, which again is a bit of a review, is biologically relevant elements. So the basic elements that are required for all known forms of life, they have been detected in the clouds. It's carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, or SNOPs. Now, in addition to SNOPs, there are other biologically relevant elements that are required for life. For example, iron. Sanjay mentioned that they had proposed as some form of iron oxidizing bacteria or some form of iron based metabolism. We know that iron is also present in the clouds. Now, whether that's something that's necessarily biologically bioavailable is not necessarily clear. Now, what I mean by that is I can have, let's say, I can have a piece of carbon, right? But in a form of a coal, that's carbon, but it's not necessarily biologically available. It has to be in a form that life can actually use, and that's not something that we can necessarily understand for Venus just yet. That's something that, with hopefully future missions, we can actually understand. We know that life can survive in the clouds, so virus, bacteria, and fungi are present in all the atmospheric compartments of Earth, whether that be in indoor air. Obviously, right now we're in the middle of a pandemic dealing with a virus that's primarily airborne. So whether that be indoor air or up to about 77 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. We also know, up to the top layers of the atmosphere is what I should say. We also know that as these bacteria or virus or fungi that are up there, they are undergoing various stressors and resisting various stressors that obviously they have to survive. Now, they're not necessarily undergoing the same stressors that life in the clouds of Venus would have to survive because of different atmospheric composition of the Venus atmosphere, but we know that it does happen here on Earth. We also know that metabolic activity has been shown in the clouds. So whether that be through the detection of ATP, for example, or some other biologically relevant elements that are related to metabolic activity. But so far as we understand, the area of aerobiology is relatively new. I believe it's been active for the past 20, maybe 30 years. So it's relatively new compared to obviously a lot of these other fields. But so far it hasn't been shown to go through a whole, these forms of bacteria or viruses or fungi have not been shown to undergo a whole life cycle in the clouds, which basically means is that they're essentially doing a cycle through the clouds where they're probably alive up at the top, but they're actually reproducing down when they come down to the bottom. And as I mentioned earlier, any organism that would be on Venus would have to endure several stressors, which, like I've already mentioned, pH, low pH, high temperatures, low water availability. So I've already described, I've described the conditions. I've described some potential organisms that we can use to understand what such life may look like. But there are some better potential terrestrial analogs. Sanjay mentioned Acidiobacillus sphaeroxidans, which is more than likely our best bet in terms of trying to understand or in terms of a terrestrial analog, our best bet for trying to study life on Venus. Its optimal temperature is about 30 degrees Celsius, but it's known to survive at temperatures up to 50 to 60 degrees Celsius, which is roughly in that range that we're trying to understand. It can survive at a pH of about 1.5 to 2.5, which is outside of the range of the estimated pH range of Venus, but just because of that doesn't necessarily mean it can potentially adapt, especially if life in the clouds has been there for about 1 billion years, as was mentioned earlier. Another example is Stygiolovus azoricus, which its optimal temperature is 80 degrees Celsius, pH of about 1 to 5.5, so it can survive well within that limit. Another really good candidate is Sidianus sulfidivorans, which is an optimal. I'm only used to singing full, so it makes my life easy. Which can survive at an optimal temperature of about 74 degrees, so it's within that temperature range, but it can also survive at a pH of down to about 0.35, which is closer to that pH range that we're interested in looking at. You also have Acidianus infernus, which is a thermophile, which can survive at temperatures up to about 90 degrees Celsius. So I mentioned these microbes. All of these have different characteristics. What properties would microbes on the clouds of Venus would necessarily have to have? So because it's of the highly acidic environment, it'd have to be an acidophile, which means that it can survive at really low pHs. Because of how hot the environment is, albeit not as hot as the surface of Venus, but still relatively high temperatures, it'd have to be a thermophile as well. Because of the low abundance of molecular oxygen, it'd have to be an anaerobe, meaning it wouldn't be able to use aerobic metabolism, so it could use anaerobic metabolism, or it could also undergo fermentation. And then because of the low abundance of water, it'd have to be a xerophile. Now, there are bacteria that are some that are both acidophiles and thermophiles. For example, what we see in the hot springs of Yellowstone. And what these bacteria are, or what these organisms are known as, is they're polyextremophiles. So they're able to survive and resist a variety of stressful conditions. And this is what we would necessarily be looking for in the clouds of Venus, or I should say, this is more than likely, if there is life in the clouds of Venus, what we would be looking for. Now, I mentioned earlier, we don't necessarily have the best candidate would probably be the Acidiobacillus sphaeroxidans, but we know that life on Earth is diverse. So life on Earth has flourished in every type of environment that we found, even despite early Earth conditions. Early Earth conditions were a lot harsher, for example, in terms of UV to life, but life was still able to arise there. Now, I mentioned earlier, let's not necessarily discount the fact that we haven't found an organism that can survive at such low pHs, because so far it's estimated that we've really only found about 1% of bacteria. And I take the approach of trying to understand potential life in the clouds of Venus with specifically bacteria outside of instead of, for example, viruses or fungi. But we've only found about 1% of bacteria, which means that odds are there very well could be life out there, or life here on Earth that could be a better terrestrial analog that's a very extreme polyextremophile that could survive in the clouds of Venus. And aside from that, because we've only understood about 1% of bacteria, there very well may be other mechanisms that life could survive, or stress response mechanisms, I should say, that could have arisen on Venus that we have yet to discover here on Earth. There is a lot of hypotheticals in this talking about life on the clouds of Venus, but obviously until we actually go there, then we'll be able to understand potential life more. Now, here on Earth, while we don't have any natural analogs for Venus, there, for example, like with Mars, a lot of the out in the desert is where they test a lot of the technology that's going there because of the very similar analogs. Or, for example, going to Europa, you would use Antarctica or Greenland, for example. Well, with here on Earth, we don't have any natural analogs, but there are some ways that we can recreate these Venus cloud analogs. For example, this is actually a sort of an old slide because obviously the Biotron is now closed, unfortunately. So one of my goals was to hopefully use the Biotron to use it, but they're actually going to be closing it down pretty soon. And actually, the Biotron has a lot of does have some history in the search for in space exploration, but that's a topic for another day. So more than likely would be, for example, using the Glenn Extreme Environments rig, which is at the Glenn Research Center. This is a rig that can have different gases, can increase the atmospheric pressure to even the pressures of the surface, or can increase the temperature up to the temperatures that we're interested in looking for. So one of the goals would be to potentially do sort of analog experiments. Let's take some Acidiobacillus sphaeroxidans, for example, and grow it in here to see if it's able to actually even grow in such environments, for example. Now, from the in terms of actually going to Venus, so Sanjay mentioned the missions that are coming up, or that are proposed, I should say. Well, some further thoughts. Obviously, we would want to, for example, we'd want to focus in the clouds, but some ideas, at least from a habitability aspect or from a genetics aspect, because that's the area that I'm interested in, would be if we were to try and somehow collect samples from the clouds and see, and it's been done here on Earth, and try and grow them on a. Sorry, I'm pointing over there because that's where my slides are. Try and grow these on media plates on the clouds of Venus, and try and basically sequence to see if we can, for example, detect cell cycle genes, which would really be a clear indicator that there's life. Obviously, life would have to be reproducing, and it would have to undergo the cell cycle to make more of itself. So that would be the best way that we would see it, and we could potentially attach this to a balloon. Obviously, these are much further thoughts that are decades away if we were able to actually do it. But more than likely, a possibility, as was mentioned earlier, would be to have some form of a balloon or some sort of. This is another hypothetical, which is the VAMP, of being able to collect samples from the clouds that aren't necessarily looking for life per se, or looking for a specific organism, or looking for DNA, but looking for signs of life, and ensuring that the right conditions are there. And that's it for me. So with that, we'll take any questions. And if Sanjay, if there's anything that needs to be cleared up, please let me know.
No, you explained it well.
Thank you. So we'd be happy to take any questions.
Questions, anyone? I'll prime the pump. Sanjay, on your one video, it looked to me like the video of Venus rotating. Mm-hmm. If the North Pole was to the top, it was spinning the opposite direction that Earth spins. Is that how it works?
That's correct, yes.
Well, how did
Venus
that happen?
spins upside down and the winds blow in the same direction from
Okay,
east to west.
thank you. I was just wondering. It always amazes me how you get oriented in space. So it is spinning the opposite direction of us.
That's another lecture.
Well, come on back. Other questions from other folks?
This is Morris here. This is a question for Sanjay, sort of a two-parter. Conditions on Venus now and conditions on Venus, let's say 2 billion years ago.
Yeah.
Right now, you have these very high winds, even on the surface by our standards,
Mhm.
and the atmospheric density is significantly greater than it is here.
Right.
Which means the force of that wind even at ground level at the same speed would be far, far greater
Right.
because of Venus than it is now.
Correct.
Wouldn't that cause tremendous erosion of any solids that were on the surface, which over, let's say, 1 billion years would essentially become an aerosol, which would be high up in the atmosphere and all over the place?
Yes, and there is wind-blown dust on Venus, and we actually have seen examples of some dust being blown up into the atmosphere when one of the Venera probes landed on the surface. So we know there are dust particles on the surface, and they certainly do rise. But the question you are really asking is about what the conditions were like over the last billion or further back into time. And the assumption is that because when there was lots of liquid water on the surface, the atmosphere was not as thick and the surface pressure was more like on Earth.
But if the surface pressure was like on Earth, the temperature would still be considerably higher.
No, because remember, the total amount of carbon on Venus and Earth is about the same. The difference is that on Earth it's in the carbonates and in rocks and the fossils, etc. But on Venus, all of that is in the atmosphere. So what we are really talking about is a super duper greenhouse effect on Venus. So the surface pressure was much lower. Well, by much lower, I mean by 2 orders of magnitude. In the early Venus, when we can conceive of Venus as a planet and liquid water. So it took, and this was looked at by Michael Way and Tony Del Genio using a model. So we don't have any firm data, but we can look at the surface rock formations and their composition and find out whether or not those rocks formed under the presence of liquid water. I think the tesserae that you find all over on Venus, they could tell us if they were formed under liquid water. So the assumption is that Venus was hospitable. In fact, the title of their first paper in 2016 was Venus the first habitable planet? And so the conditions were far more benign and very conducive to life.
So the water would have stayed there until the temperature was above the critical point, in which case it would all be gone into the atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, basically it was like Earth, and the gradual warming through increasing carbon dioxide made it warmer and warmer until all of the water evaporated away. And we know that to be the most likely scenario because of if you compare the amount of deuterium in the Venus atmosphere. As you know, there's a standard mean ocean water, the Vienna standard mean ocean water, VSMAP. And that has a certain proportion of hydrogen to deuterium. So if you compute the same ratio for Venus, that's about 100 times more for Venus. And the only way you can do that is by letting the hydrogen escape and deuterium stay behind because it's twice as heavy. And that would mean that the water would have had to evaporate, photodissociate, and the hydrogen escapes, leaving the deuterium behind. So that's the only likely scenario.
Thank you.
Other questions for Sanjay or Jaime?
Yeah. Are there any other chemicals you might expect to find other than the phosphine that would?
Well, yeah, I mean, there were two other biologically possibly significant gases that have been detected in the past, but nobody expected them, so people didn't believe the detections for real. One is methane, and the other one is ammonia. And just last night or yesterday, a paper got posted on Archive that claims a detection of glycine. So we know there are organics on Venus. Methane was discovered by the same Pioneer Venus probe that we actually looked at, and we think there's a signature of phosphine in it. But the difficulty is that we are used to Earth. Now, when we think of life, the only life we have is Earth life. When we look at an atmosphere, especially when you're looking at a planet like Venus, the assumption is that it's going to be Earth-like. I mean, a Nobel Prize winner talked about oceans and the creatures on Venus, and you have seen the movies with Zsa Zsa Gabor prancing around on the surface of Venus with forests and birds flying, the Flammarion and many other people talked about life, and that was not too long ago. This was like 100 years ago in 1918. Gustav Arrhenius, who got the Nobel Prize in chemistry, talked about Venus must have plenty of water, and so the notion was that it's Earth-like, and all of the scientists carried that bias with them. And 1974, when Venera 2 report about detection of ammonia came out, John Lewis and Goethel actually published a paper. It can't be there because it's not in equilibrium. And that was the critical assumption that everyone makes, that it's in equilibrium. And that's what I've been telling people for a long time. When it comes to Venus, don't assume anything, because Venus is full of surprises. Let me give you another one. I don't know your backgrounds, but you probably learned, if you took any chemistry or physics or physical sciences, that the Earth atmosphere is uniformly mixed, right? In the bulk constituents, oxygen, nitrogen. You go to schools and how much is nitrogen? Roughly 78%, 22% oxygen, or maybe 20 something, and the rest is water vapor, etc. But that is assumed to be fixed. The US standard atmosphere, I had to look it up. The US standard atmosphere starts with the statement, it is assumed that the Earth's atmosphere is mixed up to 86 kilometers. I have yet to find a single paper that proves that. So we know that there is every possibility that even on Earth, oxygen and nitrogen abundances vary with altitude, which is what we measured on Venus 40 years ago, but people still don't accept it. It's a tiny gradient, but it affects all our altitude scales. And here's another one. Under the current conditions on Venus, 750 Kelvin and 192 bars pressure, 92, carbon dioxide is supercritical. So is nitrogen. So is sulfur dioxide. And probably some of you drink decaf coffee at night or in the morning. And the only reason you're able to drink it is because Nestle discovered that supercritical carbon dioxide leaches out the caffeine from the coffee beans. It's used as a solvent. What it does to the minerals on the surface, we don't know. We have no idea. And so Jaime talked about liquid water being necessary for life. And there is actually some possibility that supercritical carbon dioxide may play the same role that water does in breaking the bonds. I don't know. I'm just speculating here. But when it comes to Venus, don't assume anything. That's the rule. And I forgot what your original question was. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, I just asked if there are other chemicals that were being looked at.
Yeah. So yeah. To finish that thought, they detected ammonia, they detected methane, but they couldn't explain it. So methane was just left as a puzzle, but ammonia was basically poo-pooed by most people because they assumed equilibrium, that atmosphere should be in equilibrium. And that's the same story with phosphine.
You define supercritical carbon dioxide. Would you define that, please?
Oh, if you raise the pressure from 1 bar to about 74 bars on Earth, and the temperature above 304 Kelvin, I think that's a supercritical temperature, then the properties of the gas change, like carbon dioxide. It loses all viscosity. So there's essentially no difference between gas and fluid at that point. But chemically, there's no difference. It's still the same gas, but the other properties do change, like viscosity and how it reacts with the other gases. It changes, and we don't know much about it. There's been a lot of research being done in that particular area recently. Because of the sequestration of carbon dioxide, people are looking into it. And I had come across a paper recently that suggested that if you take a mixture of carbon dioxide and nitrogen to supercritical pressures and just leave it alone in a vessel, the nitrogen separates and floats on the top. It's basically just density separation. And that's what may be happening throughout the Earth's atmosphere to a small degree, and even on Venus. On Venus, more likely because the lower 40 kilometers, as I showed on that previous slide, the atmosphere is basically very neutral, and which means that it's much easier for lighter stuff to rise up. After that, it becomes very, very stable above 50 kilometers.
I'd like to ask Jaime a couple of questions about how he did his recording for Science Friday.
Yeah.
Which I think was recorded last week and then was on the radio on Friday. How did that all shake out, and what was that like for you to be recording and fielding the questions?
So actually, before I touch on that, I wanted to add, so Sanjay said, Venus is full of surprises, and I would add that, life is also full of surprises, which is why, I make the very big, I personally really argue to the fact that we haven't discovered all forms of life just yet, or I should say all organisms just yet. I showed that value that there's an estimate that we've only discovered about 1% of life so far. Every environment that we've looked in, whether, for example, would be the hot springs of Yellowstone, or whether it be down at the bottom of the ocean, we go in, or people have gone in not expecting to find life, because these environments are too extreme, and yet we end up finding life there. So I'd say that don't let, as cliche as it sounds, life finds a way. I mean, there very well may be some form of life that we just haven't understood yet, or some sort of organism that we haven't understood yet. And there are also hypotheticals, like Sanjay said, in terms of, for example, using that carbon dioxide could be used as or supercritical carbon dioxide could be used as a replacement to a certain extent for water. There are other hypotheticals of types of life, and that is another area of astrobiology in trying to understand or trying to look for, I guess, in a sense, types of life that we don't necessarily know about. So we go in with this very Earth-like bias, but I mean, there's possibly other forms of life out there. Now, back to Tom's question in terms of Science Friday. Yeah, so that was a really cool experience. So we recorded that last week, and it was on WPR and several other NPR stations on Friday. Now, the way that I actually got a hold of that is I've been using Twitter for science outreach and for to connect with either people in my own field, so as a geneticist or a microbiologist, and also that's sort of how I got into the planetary science and astrobiology field as well, which I'm not a planetary scientist at all, but the little bit that I've gotten from Sanjay and discussions that we've had. And on my Twitter bio, I have Venus Astrobio, because that's obviously an area that I'm interested in. It's an area that I do some hypothetical work in. And one of the producers happened to reach out to me. She happened to be an alumni, or she's an alumni of UW-Madison, who's a producer now for Science Friday. She contacted me, asked, "Hey, are you interested in doing this?" There was actually already a plan, as far as I understand, to talk about Venus astrobiology shortly after the phosphine paper came out back like a month ago. But because at the same time the fires were going on in California, that sort of took precedence over the phosphine detection. And right around the same time when I was contacted, there was a paper that was released that they had discovered salt water potential salty oceans on Mars again. And I say again because I like to trash on Mars a lot. That's why I was doing the Venus versus Mars thing. And so I was contacted to do that, to do the show and talk a little bit about Venus astrobiology. So in terms of what conditions are available on Venus that are habitable for life, and also what types of life may necessarily look like. So sort of in the same context of what I presented to you all today. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. I admit it was exciting, but at the same time, really nervous because I've only been doing this work for 2-3 years now, and I definitely am. They kept on calling me an expert, and I'm like, I am not an expert on Venus. Like, I understand astrobiology, and I understand the combination of Venus and life. But yeah, I was definitely nervous that maybe something would come up that I could not define or could not necessarily talk about. But thankfully, my mentor is awesome, Sanjay, that has been helping me for the past couple of years. And yeah, so it was a lot of fun.
Jaime picks up well, and he's been great to work with. We have taken him under wings. There's a group of us, and we've been discussing this a lot. We actually held a workshop in Moscow last October, just about almost exactly a year ago. Come to think of it. And that was the first workshop that discussed the habitability of the Venus cloud layer. And that came about because I had made a pitch to the Joint Science Definition Team for Venera D, of which part of, and which I helped start that group about 8 years ago. Of course, no good deed goes unpunished, so I got asked to organize this workshop. So I did, and Jaime was able to attend that workshop.
Yeah, now I'm working on the second iteration of that workshop that we'll hopefully be hosting next year.
Well, thank you both for making all that happen. Sanjay for founding work and for taking Jaime under your wing and such. Other questions for Jaime or Sanjay?
I see one hand raised, maybe.
Yeah, I'd like to inquire if some speculation about, first of all, these are unrelated questions in a sense, and that is the question of organic activity on asteroids as they come in, and whether that might be out of the solar system or within the asteroid belt, and whether that could populate both planets. And the other question is, would there be the chance of any fossil record either on Mars or Venus for the fact that life could have existed and became extinct along the way?
Well, I can take the second question first, and then maybe Jaime can talk about the first one a little bit more. So we certainly have, depending on who you want to believe, either evidence of fossils from Mars of nanobacteria. In fact, that's what started off this interest in Mars in 1996. David McKay and colleagues published a paper about the work they had done on ALH-8401, a meteorite that was found in Allen Hills in Antarctica that was determined to have been ejected from Mars some billion years ago, maybe 2 billion years ago, age. And when they analyzed that, a sample of that meteorite, they discovered some fossils that they deemed to be hematite and formed by biological activity. Of course, how the people didn't believe it, some did. There were many people who started out to disprove them, including some work done here by on this campus. I mean, the question was, how could anything ejected from Mars, entering Earth's atmosphere, falling down to the surface, and being on the Antarctic ice for God knows how long, could have survived or could have any evidence of life. But so far, it appears to have held up pretty well. So it is possible that fossils may exist on Mars today. On Venus, it's a slightly different issue because the question is where would we find them? There has been resurfacing on Venus because of intense volcanic activity. The surface of Venus is, geologically speaking, relatively new. And there has been so much lava flowing on the surface of Venus that any fossils from the when life was in the oceans would have been very deep, and it's difficult to dig even 10 centimeters deep on Mars. On Venus, I don't know how possible it would be to dig deep and look for fossils. So meteorites solve that problem for us because the impact goes sometimes very deep, and it can bring up the dug up matter like it did for Mars. Now there was a paper published just last week again about possibility of meteorites from Venus on the moon. We may even have some meteorites from Venus on Earth, but the question is, how do you know that they are from Venus? We haven't found them yet. And now regarding the possibility of organics on asteroids, I think many of the asteroids do show some organics. We certainly have seen organics on moons of Jupiter and Saturn, at least for Saturn for sure. Enceladus, the gases that come out, the sprays do have some organics in them. Titan certainly had some on the moon. And as you know, Urey Miller experiment showed that if you put all those schnapps into a chamber, provide some water and some energy, you can form amino acids. So, organics are discovered on many planets, even on Venus, so on asteroids. Yeah, they are there, but when did they form? We don't know that. And I mean, that's the basis behind panspermia, that life could have been seeded on different planets by something coming from outer space, on Earth, on Venus, on Mars. We don't know that yet. And Fred Hoyle, many years, decades ago, talked about viruses from space, but that gets too speculative. We don't have any real data.
I'd like to follow up on that with, again, slightly different question about when, as I understand it, the life began on Earth relatively close to the beginning of the condensation of the planet.
In fact, in the first a few 100 million years, I think that's the earliest.
Right. But does that mean that life developed initially in that time and then remained effectively unchanged for almost 1 billion years afterwards?
Yeah.
Did it come somewhere else?
Well, I mean, we don't know that, but I think one part is that life began in hydrothermal vents, like some of the vents you see in the deep ocean, and there's smokers coming up. Basically volcanic activity in the water. So you certainly have lots of thermal energy. The temperature's high, and I think there are quite a few people who believe that that's where life started, or that is, it originated. And once it formed, then it certainly could have adapted to different conditions as being underwater, they probably drifted far away from the original formation location, and so it certainly could have evolved over time, and that's certainly what we would expect would have happened on Venus. But I'm too incompetent to besides giving these hand-waving arguments. Maybe Jaime can talk more knowingly, because his lab actually, there are people who do research on the origins of life on this campus and many other campuses.
Yeah, so there are a lot of there is a lot of research in trying to understand the origin of life. For now, it's only here on Earth. I mean, there are like Sanjay mentioned, there are some hypotheticals in terms of life could have originated somewhere else and have been brought here through panspermia. But so far, we can't even agree on necessarily how life formed here. So there are some people here on campus, for example, the lab of Dr. David Baum. His lab does a lot of work in or his lab focuses on trying to understand the origins of life. So there are a lot of groups. Now, sort of going back to the original question, I'll just briefly mention, odds are is that more than likely, yes, as far as we understand it from an evolutionary standpoint, is that the life that originally formed in the very beginning, which is now hypothesized to have been some form of bacteria of some sort, or some early type of bacteria, I should say. That's what developed and essentially delineated to what we have now. So.
And Jaime, did you want to comment anything about the asteroid part of the question?
Yeah, sure, I can comment on that. So there have been some organics that have been detected on some asteroids, if I'm understanding correctly. We haven't necessarily done so. I mean, I'm a big in situ kind of person where I like to actually go there and detect things, which is kind of hard to do with spacecraft because of funding and the technology challenges. But there have been some detection of organics on asteroids. Usually, interestingly enough, it's not asteroids.
Comets, I think.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah, so comets are usually the ones that are more speculated in the sense of that they're the ones that are carrying organics from the outskirts of the solar system. And in fact, in 5 days, I believe, so there's a currently mission that's orbiting or that's hanging out around the asteroid Bennu, which is
Osiris Rex.
Yeah, Osiris Rex. That's going to be doing a touch and go, so trying to collect samples that will hopefully be returned to Earth, and we can understand a little bit more about asteroids and potentially look for organics.
Hayabusa already landed on Gerasimov Churymenko asteroid some years back, and Hayabusa 2 is doing the same thing again. I think they have collected the sample, it hasn't come back to us.
Yeah, I think it's returning in like 2023 or something like that, if I remember correctly.
I know because Akatsuki telemetry was reduced during their encounter. It was last June.
That's amazing. Besides the asteroids, not asteroid, what's the meteorites that people find like at the South Pole, and what's been brought back from the moon, would that be the first time we've had samples from a comet, or not a comet, from an asteroid brought back to Earth to physically analyze in hand?
Hayabusa was the first one. Genesis brought back samples of the sun some years back. It crashed spectacularly during its soft landing.
Yeah.
The helicopter missed it, I think, and it crashed on the surface, but they were able to recover it. And there,
Stardust in 2006.
There was even a Stardust. I think didn't that capture some cometary tail data?
Yeah, that was for comet data. That was in 2006 that sample returned, and then after that it was Hayabusa. And then
Hayabusa was the first asteroid, and then Osiris Rex would be the third one after Hayabusa.
Yeah.
So those were very small particles. I'm assuming they were capturing. Are we going to have rocks now, or like hand?
Talking about 70 grams of material.
Oh, that's a lot.
I can actually show you a picture.
Bennu, it is like 150 grams, I think.
Wow, that's a
I don't
hamburger.
know what the material is for Hayabusa
Okay.
2.
Other questions from other folks? Jaime's working up and pulling up a picture, I think. Is that right, Jaime?
Yep. Yep.
So one of the questions I was wondering about was where did all the water on Venus go? And did some of it end up on Earth? If it went into into space, did we sweep some of that up?
Yeah, it depends on how the water was lost. Some of it was probably lost through impacts, and because of the D2H ratio, we know some of it must have been due to photolysis, which means that it must have evaporated first during the warming phase. But what the partitioning would be between impacts and warming, we don't know, or how much water there was. So that's why people want to go back to Venus and determine the astropic ratio, so you can determine what the situation may have been like. That would explain the noble gas astropic ratios found currently.
All right, thank you. Jaime, what you got there?
Yeah, so this is so on the left, I'm showing the Stardust mission, which collected samples from a comet, and then on the right is basically the capsule that was dropped off, collected with those samples. And then the other two missions. So this is Hayabusa, which Sanjay mentioned, is the first one to return with a sample from an asteroid, and then Hayabusa 2. I believe it's either returning this year or it's going to be.
I think it's in a few months. I think maybe.
Yeah, it's
21.
I think December. Yeah, something like that. And then Osiris-Rex, which is going to be doing its touch and go and trying to collect those samples in like 5 or 6 days and returning in 2023.
I should note that the Russians had attempted to return samples from Phobos, I believe, in the 90s. Phobos mission was supposed to do that. It had a hopper. Unfortunately, Phobos 1 and Phobos 2 were both lost due to technical difficulties. And currently, there is a mission under consideration by JAXA, under development, I should say, by JAXA with some NASA called MMX, which will try to repeat that sample return from, I think Phobos, but I'm not sure. It could be Deimos.
Very cool. Other questions?
And actually, I'll plug, Tom, if you don't mind, real quick. I'll plug that I actually, yesterday we had I gave a talk at Space Place that was released yesterday regarding planetary protection and sample return. So if you're interested a little bit more about that, you can go ahead and listen to that over at the Space Place website.
That'd be great. So that's on their YouTube website?
Yep.
Good.
I just want to point out there is no protection protocol for Venus, thankfully, which means if you want to go back and find life,
Yep.
it's much easier, unlike Mars. You can bring the samples to nearer, but you can't bring them down to the surface.
Wow. All right, any other questions? If not, thank you both very much. Thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Our pleasure. It was fun.
Yes, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
And as I mentioned to Paul Randall earlier, we've been calling this Frontiers in Life Sciences for 15 years or a little longer, and this is probably the closest to the real frontier we've ever come. So it's at least in terms of far, far away. So really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right.
Tom, do you record these talks?
Yeah, I'm recording it on my screen here, and I'll try to edit it and post it in the next couple of days.
All right, wonderful.
It'll be at the Wednesday Night at the Lab
Oh, okay. Very good. Thank you.
website. Yeah, YouTube
Cool.
site. All right. Thank you all very much. Hope to see you next
Thanks.
Wednesday at 1
Have a good one.
o'clock.
Thanks, Tom.
All right. Thank you.